Okay. So are we running now? There's Gayla Greenberg, Amy and Galena in Maryland. Good to see them. Oh, that's Amy. I know what Amy that is. Okay. All right. 4. Down to 1. 2. Joel. Tammy. Elnora's mom. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, welcome to our Teaching Strategies lecture series and an education course. We welcome those in the classroom with me and those of you viewing on the live stream. This lecture series will explore and discuss, or we have begun to explore and discuss the various strategies used to teach effectively at all levels of instruction. And the focus is primarily academic, but it can definitely be applied to religious instruction. And so the series revolves around a model profile of a competent teacher, and we covered all the different points in that competency profile in our first lecture back on September 16th. The text for the course is Models, Strategies, and Methods for Effective Teaching. We're following the outline in here. Of course, I'm the teacher, so I'm going to say about that what I want to, about the topics covered by it. But if you wanted to get that, I know they're available used or new at Amazon for less than $10. If you wanted to kind of look ahead and be a little better prepared for the lectures as they come along. Just to review, on September 16th, we began the lecture series and we discussed Chapter 1 and the competency profile. In the interim, we watched, you were given the opportunity to watch Maintaining Teacher Effectiveness video by Don Moss. And then we talked about that a little bit before, or at the beginning of our second lecture, and that was October 14th, when we discussed communication skills. And then, since then, we made available lecture 2, or video 2 of the Maintaining Teacher Effectiveness series. And in that video, Don Moss talks about teacher actions. If you did watch that, I'm just going to review with you some of the questions that he provides to kind of get you thinking along with him as he goes through that. First, he asks, how do you get to your target objective? And there's a lot of different ideas there on how to do that. But when we write an objective, we should be able to answer 2 questions. Or the objective, if we're going to write out an objective, it should be able to answer 2 questions. What do we want students to learn? And how do we plan to find out if they have learned? Sometimes we go into class and we have kind of a vague, a foggy idea of what we want to accomplish. But if we want to accomplish better, we should write out an objective. I want them to learn this, and this is how I'm going to know that they have learned it. There's a lot of books, even complete books on objectives, a lot of writing and theory and different things about it, but that kind of distills it into two very important parts of it without all the extras that might be involved in it. What do I want the students to learn, and how do I plan to find out if they have learned? So there were 4 actions that he talks about that will increase the probability of reaching the objective. What will increase the probability of getting to where you want to go? And the first was to provide relevant information. That's the key word. about information is that it's relevant. We could provide lots of information, but if it's not connected to what we want them to learn, then it's not going to be helpful. That could be, and this information could be in a lot of different forms. It could be a lecture, it could be an activity that we have them participate in. We could read a book or books. We could have visuals. We could show them a film. We could take them on a field trip. We could give a demonstration. Lots of different ways to provide information. The key is that it's relevant. And then, to increase the probability of reaching our objective, we need to ask questions. And I would say that the important thing there is that they be real questions. Not necessarily questions that have, when you write them out, there's a question mark at the end of it, but a question that stimulates their thought. In order to know whether you're heading in the direction you think you're going, you need to hear what their words saying things, and if they're just repeating what you've said, you don't really know that they understand. You don't really know if you've met your objective, unless your objective is just for them to be able to repeat what you've said. But most of us don't have that as a goal in our teaching. Excuse me. We want to accomplish more than just repetition. Once we get out of even, of course, in some of our first, second grade classes, a lot of what we do is repetition. But even in there's certain classes where we don't want them just to repeat what we've said. We want to have some feedback on their understanding, and asking proper questions helps with that. Then we'll want to design activities to validate the learning, to be able to tell whether they have learned. There's different ways to get answers and activities that validate the learning would be they participate in something where they see what they've learned taking place. And then there are our responses to the efforts of the learners. So part of what we do in a classroom is respond to the students, and our responses have an effect on us reaching our objective. We could have no response. But that is a response. If a student does something that would typically produce a response, and we don't respond, we are saying something by that lack of response. We could say that they did well. We could repeat what they said. These are our responses to their answers, perhaps. And then there's a technique called focus on the learning. And I want to just repeat what he said here a little bit. If I ask a question, we could make it absurdly simple. I could say, Bill, what color are the outside walls of the school? And if Bill says, they're blue, I could say, yes, that is the color of the outside walls of the school. By focus on the learning, what happens when we ask questions is, when we ask a question and there's a certain level of tension or anxiety that occurs in the classroom because all the students are wondering whether they're going to be called on to give the answer. And that's a good anxiety. We want that attention on what's being said. That's why questions are so useful. So we ask that question, the tension or the anxiety rises. Once we call on somebody, the anxiety or the focus relaxes because they think, okay, now I'm not going to have to answer this question. And they don't even listen to the answer because they have they've been conditioned to think they're going to hear. I'm going to repeat the answer. Do you hear that? I have a little buzz. I don't know if it's a light bulb. Okay, so hopefully you all can't hear that. But anyway, so we're in the middle of this. We've asked the question. All the students are anxious. Am I going to have to answer it? Finally, you call on one, and everyone relaxes. They stop paying attention, and this one has to give his answer. But when you answer with, yes, that is the color of the outside of the walls of the school. Now, they just realized that they made a mistake by not listening to the student's answer. We want to maintain a level of attention to what's going on. And our responses, the way we respond, the way we ask questions, all of this has a tremendous amount to do with that. When students relax their attention, then they're not putting their effort into it, and they're less likely to get to where we want to take them. So, our 4 actions that increase the probability of getting our students to the objective: providing relevant information, asking questions, design activities to validate the learning, and our response to their efforts, whether it's something that they've produced or an answer to a question or even a question that's produced from an activity or something, that our responses to that have a large impact on the learning that takes place in the classroom. So those are most of the things that he covered in a much more enjoyable fashion and more thoroughly, but that's kind of a review of what Don Moss covered in the Maintaining Teacher Effectiveness video on teacher actions. So tonight, in our series, we're going to look at diverse students. We're going to discuss the idea of diversity in students. And I know this is a hot topic in the world around us. There's almost an obsession with diversity. We have to praise and celebrate diversity. And I think as Christians, in the back of our mind, there's a little bit of, that doesn't seem right. And I recognize that. But at the same time, God has made us differently. And just because the world looks at the diversity in students, in classrooms, and addresses it a certain way, doesn't mean that we can just totally neglect the idea that people are different in our classrooms. And in fact, so in one sense we can neglect, we're to treat everybody the same way, but in another sense we're to love every single one of our students, we're to love each other as mankind, and if we understand better a person's differences and that allows us to help them better, then that is acting as a Christian toward them. So that is my idea as we go through these ideas of diversity. I'm not, tremendously filled with ideas on these subjects with lots of learning. I'm very skeptical myself of all the different studies that are done on diversity. But at the same time, I think it's something that we should discuss. And so we will. First off, we talk about learning styles. We'll just mention learning styles. People, if you've tried to teach in a classroom, you might have heard somebody say, well, I just don't learn that way. Or maybe you say that. I don't learn this way. Some people learn in a linear way. Some people need it laid out step by step. Some people like it big chunks. Just give me a chunk. Some people want to see the big picture. So somebody that's step by step doesn't want to see the big picture. They just want to tell me what to do next. So people do learn in different ways, and it's a personal thing. We are all different, and so we learn in different ways. Of course, there's similarities between people, but learning happens it does happen in different ways, and so we recognize that. And if we were to define a learning style, what do we mean when we say learning style? Learning style is how a person learns, or the process through which a person learns. It is. There's a lot of different beliefs about learning. In the old days, you might say all students must be, sitting upright with their hands folded and their feet flat on the floor in order to learn. Now, I think that that's proper in a classroom. It's proper to have a well-organized, disciplined classroom. But I also know that there are students who can learn rolled out on the floor. I teach in the Bible club on Saturday, and we have kids there. It's not a Christian school, obviously. I remember years and years ago, a little kid, we could not get him to sit still. He wasn't bothering other people. We just let him lay there. But, when it was time to answer questions, he knew the answers to questions better than anybody else in the room. And so clearly, he didn't have to sit at a desk with his hands folded and his feet on the floor to be able to hear and understand what was being said. So, while this is true, I'm not promoting that we just take the desk out of our classrooms and roll the mats out and let kids lay around because we want to accommodate their learning style. I guess what we just need to understand is that some of the things that we think, is absolutely imperative in order for people to learn isn't necessarily so. People have done a lot of studies, but it's interesting that all the studies, somebody will study trying to take a person's learning style and match the teaching style to the learning style. Studies suggest that matching the learning activities with the learning style has no effect on achievement. That's interesting. So there are these different styles, but trying to match, getting to match isn't the golden key to make sure that students learn. Learning is effort. It's work. And so really, if someone's going to learn, they put the effort into it. Having variety is helpful. Recognizing there's differences in your classroom is helpful and it's loving, but it's not imperative. We shouldn't feel this huge burden to know the learning style of the 7 or 14 or 25 students in our classroom and match our teaching style or our learning activities to each one of that so that we can, guarantee that they've learned, that they can learn. That's not a guarantee. It doesn't really affect achievement. So we have learning styles. People learn in different ways. One of the things when we think about learning styles and learning different ways that people talk about is hemispheric mode. Okay, so now we never call it hemispheric mode. We say I'm right-brained or left-brained, right? Right brain and left brain. Left mode learners, right mode learners. There's a lot here, so I'm just going to actually just read from the textbook because it's kind of interesting. We know this. We see this. People are analytic and deductive or intuitive and deductive. The guys that analyze or the girls that analyze, they are left brain or left mode learners. Those that just kind of feel it in their gut and catch it all and make deductions from there, they're right-brained, right mode learners. So I'm going to read a little bit here just to give a little bit more of the description of these. So left mode learners are analytic and deductive. They prefer logic. They're rational. They respond to verbal instructions. They controlled and systematic. They solve problems logically, sequentially, looking at all the parts. Judgments are made objectively. They're good planners. They're analytic readers. And behavior is planned and structured. They prefer established and certain information and conventional classrooms. They rely on language and thinking and remembering, and their feelings are controlled. Hierarchical authority structures are preferred. They like multiple choice tests and respond to the structure of the environment. They like talking and writing, are logical, and they can see cause and effect relationships and draw on previously accumulated and organized information. So these are your analyzers, your left brain people. Then right brain people, or right mode learners, they're intuitive and deductive. They're chunkers, and they see patterns. They like open-ended, random experiences and want instructions to be demonstrated. They don't want you to tell them how to do it. They want you to show them how to do it, demonstrated. Problems are solved through hunches or by discovering patterns. Their judgments are made subjectively in a fluid, spontaneous way. They enjoy working with elusive, uncertain information. They rely on drawing or manipulating, and they prefer essay tests. Feelings are freely shared, and they are good at metaphoric language and imagery. They like synthesizing, bringing things together, experimenting, and prefer an experiential approach. So they're very different, right brain, left brain, but really our goal should be encouraged to use the whole brain. All right, we have somebody that is left mode dominant. We should encourage them to strengthen the right brain. Somebody's right brain dominant. We should encourage them to strengthen their left brain. We should encourage them to utilize their strength, but use their strength to strengthen their weakness. And we're going to say that again in all of these areas. We recognize differences, but when someone says, well, I'm different, and that's their badge of honor, and that's their excuse for not doing something. We recognize differences, but we're not going to give it to a student as an excuse for not accomplishing. Whether they're right brain, left brain, or learn this way or that way. I think that's a proper way to think about these things. We recognize their existence, but they are no excuse. They're an opportunity for us to help them learn better and for them to get stronger. All right. So there's left brain, right brain, blah, blah, blah. Sorry about that. I'm still left mode, right mode. And then there are learning modality preferences. So there's basically 3 learning modalities, and people prefer to learn in one of these 3. It's going to make sense when I say them, or you might even know them already. There's visual learners, auditory learners, and tactile or kinetic learners. So a visual learner is somebody that likes to see the information. Auditory learner is someone who would rather hear it, prefers to hear it, and tactile or kinetic are those that would like to handle it or manipulate it. If you teach in mathematics, you've probably heard of manipulatives, and so you can teach multiplication and all of these things using little sticks or using objects, and you manipulate them. That helps a kinetic learner. You can have them read the problem. You can read the problem to them. They can hear the problem. So there's different preferences. We should recognize what kind of learner we are. Most of the time, we teach in the way that we like to learn. We provide information in the way that we are most comfortable receiving it. So even though, so I'm speaking, but my speaking, I think, is probably more along the lines of a book, because I like to read. I'd like to read it, figure it out. But we should understand our strengths, but then again, we should enhance our teaching by strengthening our weaker modalities. So if we're a hands-on type of learner, then as teachers, we want to learn to be, how can we take that strength and increase our strength in other areas? If we're an auditory, let me hear it learner, strengthen our other modalities. So, we're flying right along. We might get done early tonight. There was, in the 80s and 90s, a man who has studied education, a Harvard professor. His name was Howard Gardner. He developed a theory of multiple intelligences. And do I still have that up? Yeah, okay. So, actually, I'm going to send you off. If you're watching through YouTube and can see the chat, I'm going to put up a website there to a place where you can go later on to see this. So Howard Gardner developed a theory about multiple intelligences, and he called it intelligence. We all have intelligence, and we get our intelligence, or we have intelligences. He called it an ability or a set of abilities that lets a person solve a problem or produce a product. So we have we have these intelligences that give us the ability to solve problems or produce a product. And he said there was 8, I think he said 7 or 8 different intelligences. There's the spatial intelligence, the bodily kinetic intelligence, we have musical intelligence, linguistic intelligence, logical mathematical intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, intrapersonal intelligence, and naturalist intelligence. I'm going to the spatial intelligence is the ability to perceive the visual spatial world accurately and perform transformations upon one's perception. This is highly developed in hunters, scouts, guides, interior designers, artists, and inventors. So if somebody has a spatial intelligence, they're picture smart, we might say. Bodily kinetic intelligence is expertise in using one's whole body to express ideas and facility in using one's hands to produce or transform things. Highly developed in actors, athletes, sculptors, craftsmen, mechanics, and surgeons. So somebody's got bodily kinetic intelligence, they're body, sports, or hand smart. Musical intelligence is the capacity to perceive, discriminate, transform, and express musical forms. Highly developed in musical performers, aficionados, and critics. So somebody's got a musical intelligence, they're musical smart. Linguistic would be word smart, the capacity to use words effectively, orally, and in writing. Highly developed in storytellers, orators, politicians, poets, playwrights, editors, and journalists. The thought occurs to me here, I don't think there's a lot of politicians that are not linguistic intelligent. They have very little ability to get up and speak in front of people. And that's why if you, sometimes I've met Christians who are in politics, and since they've had to, teach a Sunday school class or something like that, they're much more effective in expressing themselves to audiences than somebody who's studied law and policy all their life. Anyway, it helps a politician to be linguistic smart, word smart, among those other ones. Just occurred to me. Logical mathematical intelligence is the capacity to use numbers effectively and to reason well. It's highly developed in mathematicians, tax accountants, statisticians, scientists, computer programmers, and logicians. Not magicians, logicians. So they are logic smart. Interpersonal is the ability to perceive and make distinctions in the moods, intentions, motivations, and feelings of others. This intelligence can include sensitivity to facial expressions, voice, and gestures, and the ability to respond effectively to such cues. For example, to influence people. So if they're intrapersonal intelligence, they're people smart. Intrapersonal is self-knowledge, the ability to act adaptively based on that knowledge. This intelligence includes having an accurate picture of one's own moods and motivations and the capacities for self-discipline. So intrapersonal intelligence is being self-smart. And then naturalist is the ability to observe and operate hands-on in nature and the environment. Awareness of conservation practices and how to care for plants, being sensitive to stimuli from the natural world, recognize patterns. So they're environment smart, sort of. So all these intelligences, so these are not exclusive. It's not like you can only have one intelligence. In fact, we'll put this link on the course page. But I would encourage you, even if it's just for the fun of it, to go to that site, personalitymax.com, and then /multiple intelligences. And it's got a little spot there where you can take the quiz or test. I think they call it a test for free. I'm sure at the end they want you to donate something or give them your email address or something. But you can take that test for free, and you answer these questions, and you'll be able to see how those questions have judged your abilities in these different areas, and it'll tell you that you're a picture smart person and a music smart person, or you're a people smart person, and it'll show you how your strengths are there. I thought that was, when I took a class many years ago, we took a test like that, and it was very interesting to see how those things come together. All right, now I got papers all over the place. Let's get rid of those. So, all these things kind of, to me, are kind of right on the level of what we do in a classroom with delivering information and teaching. There's and who we're teaching. They are an auditory learner or a left brain learner, or they have a strong musical intelligence or weak logical intelligence. All these things are mixing together and all that in the classroom, and there's a lot to kind of grasp. I think sometimes I think about it and I think that's too much to grasp. I'm just going to do my best, and that's just fine. We ought to do our best if we can just pick up a little bit, one little thing today, and implement it this week, and one little tiny thing add on to that the next week or the next month. Every little addition is making us a better teacher. So these things are good to just be aware of at the beginning, and then to increase our understanding of them to help us be able to present the information in more than just one way. So now I'm going to shift. So those are kind of more on the intellectual level, the differences that we have in our classrooms. Next, I want to talk about cultural differences. And I think, sometimes Christian school teachers, we don't have very many cultural differences in our classrooms. But at the same time, Sunday school teachers, we have huge cultural differences in our classrooms. And if our school is just a little bit, trying to reach the community, and we ought to be trying to influence more than just the people in our church, we're going to have different cultures inside our classroom. Maybe not radicalized cultural differences, but different cultures in our classrooms. And so let's just think about that a little bit. What is culture? So a definition that you might find on culture is the unique lifestyle of a particular group of people, or the rules that generate and guide behavior. So whatever culture you have, they have a unique lifestyle, and there's certain rules. Now they might not be like the handbook, printed rule book, but there's a certain way that if you're in that culture, you act a certain way because the culture says you act that way. So the culture is defined as the lifestyle of a group and the rules that generate and guide behavior. Another person I respect highly as a Christian and as a thinker about these things has said that every culture grows out of the cult of the group. Now, if we use the word cult in a like in a historical sense, every group of people had a cult center. That would be the worship center. And the worship center drives and guides the behavior for the rest of the community. Okay, right? And what did we just say a culture is? A culture is something, the rules that generate and guide behavior. So what rules generate and guide behavior? Your religious rules. That's where your culture comes from. Whether, you could take any religion, every religion, when that religion is dominant in a certain area, its effect is plainly seen in the culture. I can think here of Mexico. You think of China. Think of Japan. Think of anywhere. The religious, the thoughts, the beliefs religiously, the religious foundation guides and produces the rules that guide behavior. think about cultures with no religion. Okay, that is, no religion is a religion. It's like no God. There's no God. What guides that behavior? So everything in the culture there is a unique lifestyle of a particular group, and the culture grows out of the religious thinking. And this is something that we as Christians can really help us to understand in this area. So some of the things that are clear, that we can see clearly that distinguish a culture is personality, language, social structure, occupations, and the environment. The environment is really the natural environment has an effect on a culture. Why do Eskimos wear warm clothing? Because of their natural environment. So there's some things that are, whether they're Christians or shamans or whatever, you live in a cold environment, you're going to wear warm clothing. So it's not all the culture, the religion. But these things have an effect, and they kind of produce what we would see as a culture. Personality, language, there's a particular language. It's a common language between them. There's a social structure. Excuse me. And a social structure will be very much influenced by what they believe about a family and community. Occupations, what will also be affected by that. If it's a good even their environment will affect their occupations. These things work together to produce what we would call a culture. So, I would like to take, these are secular definitions, but I've studied them again, and I don't see any real issue with any of them, with some definitions of the degrees of our thought about other cultures. And so let's just go through them. First, one of the things that we have, all of us have, is an attitude or a social attitude. So this is defined as a readiness to respond favorably or unfavorably to a person, object, situation, or event. It is our mental set. It's the feelings an individual has toward various problems that determine the way he or she will act. It is a readiness to verbalize or behave. So we have this attitude. We have a social, and it's applied to cultural group of people. That's a social attitude. Okay, I'm going to give an illustration of that after I give the next definition. The next definition is a belief. So we have attitudes and beliefs. A belief is something that is thought to be true, right? I believe. I think that this is true. And we can have beliefs about other people. We all have beliefs about other people. So I'm going to read 3 different examples from the textbook, and they're good examples. They're kind of like, did you really say that type of examples? But here they are. This is a social attitude. I can't stand blacks. Okay, so that's an attitude. I haven't done anything. It's just a feeling that I have. It's something that I have toward people. Then, here is a belief that would be kind of probably associated with that attitude. Blacks aren't bright. All they do is play basketball, dance, and use jive talk. Now, that's a belief. I'm not saying I believe that. I'm stating my belief. It's not my belief. But I'm stating that. That's a statement. That's a belief. That's different than an attitude. I could like blacks because all they do is, they're not bright and all they do is play basketball. But I could also not like them. So there's separate, the attitude and the belief. Here's another pair, attitude and belief. Here's an attitude. I would never let my daughter marry an East Indian. Okay, a belief. East Indians always treat their wives as servants. Okay, so there's a belief. I believe that this is the way they always act, and then I have this attitude. And they could be connected or not connected. Here's another one, another social attitude. I'd never associate with the white boys in my classroom. Okay, that's an attitude. Never going to do that. The belief, white boys have no morals. Okay, that's a belief. Somebody says that about something, that's what they believe. Now, obviously, beliefs can be incorrect, and attitudes can be based on wrong beliefs. Most of the time, our attitudes are based on a belief or a perception, but they can be based on the wrong thing, and therefore we have a wrong attitude. So if we have an attitude or belief, when we have an attitude or belief that is held without consideration of the facts, that is by definition prejudice. Prejudice means to prejudge. So if I'm going to judge a situation, what am I going to do? I'm going to take some facts, I'm going to weigh them and judge them. So if I take the facts and judge them and come to a conclusion, that's not prejudice. But if I just don't look at the facts and I just look at a person's skin color, or they're a guy or they're a girl or they're from a certain part of town, and I just automatically make a judgment about them, then I'm prejudiced. So prejudice is an attitude or belief formed or held without really considering the facts. It is for or against something or someone. So it's for something or it's against them. It's judging without facts and evidence. And think of this, we often, I think because it happens most of the time this way, we think of prejudice in a negative factor. Somebody is prejudiced against someone in a bad way, in a harmful way. I should say in a bad way. But sometimes we're prejudiced toward people in a good way, and that can be harmful. You know, we could say something like, every Korean student has an IQ of whatever. So then we prejudge every Korean person that we see as super intelligent, and what happens? Then our expectations are up there. Well, you should be able to do this. You're a Korean, and that really doesn't have anything to do with it, really. That's prejudging. That's being prejudiced in a favorable way, but it turns out to be negative if we're trying to teach or something like that. So prejudice is something that we should not do. As much as we hear the idea of, I don't pay attention to the news that much, and I hear about prejudice and discrimination too much. If you pay attention to the news, you see it a lot, and we get callous to it. But honestly, as Christians, we're not to be prejudiced. Think about what James said to, you have somebody come into your church in fancy clothing and somebody else comes in poor clothing, and you treat the one nice and the other. These things ought not to be. What are those people doing? They're prejudiced. They're judging that the rich person is going to be favorable toward them and going to be able to help them. So, and actually their prejudice, their thoughts turn into actions, and that's what discrimination is. So discrimination is prejudice that's transmitted into actions. It is definite behavior that is the result of a prejudiced attitude or belief. Now, I think it's interesting because a lot of times people will experience something, they'll experience an action against them, and the action is against their wrong activities. Okay, those activities have been judged to be wrong, and they experience a result of their wrong activities, and they claim that they're being discriminated against. That's not discrimination. Discrimination is when you treat somebody, you have actions towards someone that's based solely on a prejudice, which prejudice is based solely on nothing. It's just on a perception, on a wrong belief or an inaccurate, a bad attitude, not on facts. And that's interesting to know, I think. So then another related idea is stereotyping. Stereotyping it involves a fixed set of ideas. It's often exaggerated and distorted, and it regards all members of a group as the same. So if you say, if you see a certain person and stereotyping says, well, let's just take the last one about, let's say Korean. All Koreans are smart. Okay, let's just say that's a stereotype. all Koreans are smart. And I see a Korean person, I say, you must be smart. You're a Korean. That's stereotyping. Or I say, we're going to have this contest, and it's really mentally intensive. I'll say, whatever his name is, he has an advantage because he's a Korean. Well, not necessarily. That's stereotyping. So that's the idea of assigning all of our beliefs or social attitudes about a certain class of people to any one person who's in that class. We're stereotyping. Then, along the same line is the idea of overgeneralization. Where'd my paper go? Overgeneralization happens when a generalization is broad to the point of distortion. So we have to generalize. We say women are shorter than men. Okay, that's a generality. I don't know if this one could be overgeneralized, but we have to generalize. But when we take a generalization or a stereotype and we make it so broad to the point of distortion, then that's an overgeneralization. Then there's the idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. So if I am prejudiced towards someone or some class of people or discriminatory, I will find support for that. That I will, as I'm reading the paper, I will notice when somebody from that class of people or that culture fits my prejudice. Now, I won't notice when somebody from that culture doesn't fit, when they break my mold. And what that's called is self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think this way about a certain culture, you're going to be able to find proof to support what you believe. You're going to be able to fulfill your prophecies because that's the only thing you see. You'll always see the conditions that prove that your position is accurate. And then the last definition that's all related to this idea of what's the word? Degrees of thought about differences in culture, and that is scapegoating. So scapegoating is the process of singling out a group to blame them for the mistakes or crimes of others. The classic illustration of this is Hitler in World War II. The problems of Germany were the Jews' fault. Another classic is Nero in ancient Rome. The problems of Rome was the Christians' fault. So we could say, honestly, there's a little bit of scapegoating going on in America today when we say the problems of our country is the immigrants' fault. It's the illegal immigrants' fault that all this bad is happening. Well, we have a bad country before we had any of them. We have sin all around us. So that is an issue of scapegoating. So you just single out a group and say, this is why we have all of our problems. This is where all of our problems are coming from. That's scapegoating. And that's also, all these things are different ways, different issues that come up when we look at cultures that are different than us. And I just want to off the cuff give some comments on it. I kind of have already at the beginning. We should not be this way. Now, at the same time, because we say we believe that the culture grows out of the religious beliefs, and we believe our religious beliefs are the right ones, they're from the Bible, okay? So that makes us right and everybody else wrong. Okay, that could be true. In fact, as long as we're following the Bible, we are right. But the Bible also tells us how to treat people that are not like us. So just because we're right doesn't mean that we can have these types of attitudes and beliefs toward people. We can say, I don't have any problem saying that a Buddhist is believing the wrong thing. I believe that, and that's based on evidence. Okay, but I don't have to treat him like a second-class citizen because of that. He's a person that God loves, and I ought to love. And all people are that condition. So we have to be careful that as Christians, we can get this high and mighty, we're right, and we are, but sometimes being, we can have the wrong attitude about how right we are, and that causes us problems. So we should be aware of these things, be careful of them. At the same time, we should take a biblical view, I would say, toward them, not just recognize that being prejudiced is wrong, and so I have to do what the current world thinking says I have to do in order to not be prejudiced. Excuse me. All right, another kind of just skipping to another facet of this idea of diversity, and this is something to look out for, and it is bias in books and curricular materials. Okay, so if we want to make sure that we're presenting the truth, we will watch out for bias in our books and curricular materials. Now, everyone, just to take a side note, everyone censors. Every single book cuts stuff out because there's no book that can hold everything. So a book takes whatever information and presents what it can to present a certain story. If that story is true, that's good. But we should look for things that may be happening in there. I think if you have good Christian curriculum, you're not going to have this. The good Christian curriculum is going to be accused that it has these things in it. But we can point our fingers at secular curriculum for doing this too. And so I don't know that we're going to get in a finger-pointing argument, but I think it's worth hearing these definitions of what happens in books and curricular materials. It will help us to view it and to be able to identify it, call it out when we see it. First is omission. So a book that's telling a certain, teaching a certain thing is biased if it omits, if it fails to mention all the relevant facts. Okay, of course it can't mention all the facts, but if there's if I tell a very, compelling story, but I leave out this one fact that changes the whole story, why am I doing that? Because I want to produce a certain effect. I don't want, if I'm a criminal, I could tell the whole, I'm doing all this except for this one thing, and as soon as you know this one thing, then I'm guilty. But if you don't know this one part of the whole story, I'm innocent. Omission. And that happens in more places than a courtroom. It happens a lot in books. And of course, our view would be the truth is in the Bible, and the Christian view of the world is the proper view of the world. So most secular books, even while they're only trying to be agnostic and not present a religious point of view, if you don't present the Christian point of view, you're omitting the most relevant facts there are. And so you don't get a true view. So omission. Defamation. Defamation is the practice in books or curricular materials of calling attention to the faults of a group or portraying a group stereotypically. So if the only time in your curricular materials a certain group comes up, you're pointing out their faults, then that would be, by definition, defamation. Disparagement. Disparagement is belittling or denying the contributions of a group. Now I see and this is, somebody's going to call this something else, but I see overreaction to this in things like Black History Month or this whatever History Month. I feel sorry for blacks. They only can have history 1 month out of the year. And I'm being sarcastic there, but because, our goofy culture today wants to somehow make reparations to black folks for the awful treatment that they received as slaves, we emphasize more. Rather, we kind of build up more than what's there, because they would claim that their accomplishments have been belittled and denied throughout history. Accumulative implication. Only selecting information that reflects positively on one group and or negatively on another. So as we're telling a story, I think it's mostly in history, we would say, but let's just use history. It's the easiest. We're telling a history, And if we only tell the things that show positively about a group and not negatively, we have a cumulative implication. It occurs to me that this is why we know the Bible is true. God tells the good and the bad about his heroes. He doesn't just tell the good, or he doesn't just tell the bad about things. So, but this cumulative implication, you get the impression that that's not true. Obliteration. Obliteration is ignoring significant historical aspects of something. We have this happening in America today. We have people, tearing down statues. They're going to obliterate certain portions of our history. That is bias. Disembodiment. This is the idea of using terms such as menace and annihilation as part of progress in a casual or depersonalized manner. So if you're describing progress in a culture and this progress annihilated a certain menace, that is the example of the term disembodiment. So you should look for bias. And the reason I bring this up is because I think that everyone has a bias, as I think it was Ken Ham said in a cassette tape I listened to in college. Everyone has a bias. It's just which bias is the best bias to be biased about. Okay? And the scriptural bias is the one that we want to have. But we should also understand the terms and understand what's happening and be able to identify it in things that are around us. Another topic of diversity, differences, and this is children of poverty. Children of poverty. Now, when I hear about children of poverty, we were talking today about places in our community that are just handing out turkeys by the hundreds. So we're collecting so much, we're handing it out. Nobody is poor, but there are kids that are children of poverty. And the first thing I think of when I think of children of poverty are the adults that cause it. We have our American culture is so rich and so affluent that our government gives money to people, and those people spend that money on themselves. It's given to them to help them help their children, and the children still suffer, and they do. We can say that it ought not to be, and it ought not to be, but it still happens. You have kids, if you're in a community that has these types of areas in them, and you bring them into church or something, you know that they suffer. Even if it's just suffering of only eating Pop-Tarts for breakfast all week long. That's a treat. That's not nourishment, though. Okay, so what people find, we look at the people of children of poverty, is that they suffer. Their physical health suffers. So their physical health suffers, their mental health suffers. And, we can laugh about mental health, but when you live in a family that the parents don't care, their minds are going to be hurt by these situations. They have barriers to health care. You say, well, they don't have, well, the children have barriers. The parents might be the barriers. Okay? But they have barriers to health care. They're hungry sometimes. And if they're not hungry, they have poor nourishment. They have difficulty in school. Why do they have difficulty in school? Because their homes are a mess. They don't know how to organize themselves. They don't know how to have a pencil when they're supposed to have a pencil. These things snowball and they have difficulties in school, and then they end up with school-related difficulties as illiteracy. We can say it ought not to be, but it is around us. People are illiterate, they're delinquent, they have difficulty adjusting to changes. So if you have students in your Sunday school class, or maybe even in your school classroom, or you have opportunities to work with these people, then how can you help them? You can't necessarily just bring food to their house. I mean, you could do that, but that's not going to take care of it. They're already getting money. So in an academic sense, what can you do in your realm? What can you do to help them? Here are some ideas that are helpful for this. And I want to yes. Okay, so we'll get there. So First is build on the strengths they have. In a certain sense, they're poor. They might get treated differently in other places or whatever. Notice what strengths they have and build those strengths. Let them grow in those areas. By doing that, help them use those strengths to conquer their weaknesses. Sometimes kids are told they can't do it. They've been told forever, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that, you're poor, you're dumb, you're whatever. Every kid has something they can do. Help them strengthen that and help them use that strength to strengthen other weaknesses, conquer other weaknesses. Establish, here's something that's very important, and we tend to want to let up on it, and that is establish clear and consistent expectations for behavior. Okay, so it doesn't, even if they're poor, they can still behave. Clear and consistent expectations for behavior is very helpful. Much of the problem in their home are behavioral problems. Their parents don't know how to behave. And so that causes issues that turn into physical issues and intellectual issues. So establish clear and consistent expectations for behavior for them. That helps them. Place a high priority on developing reading skills. Place a high priority on developing reading skills. We have even tried to do this in our children's ministries. It's not like we sit down and have a reading circle, but we try to incorporate knowing how to read and helping them learn how to read, just a little here and a little there, because reading, being able to read, liberates a person. It really does. And so that should be a high priority if you have kids that have a lot of things holding them back. Teaching them to read will be something that really can help them. Help them see the relevance of what they're doing in school to what they will do in life or what they are doing in life. Work to be sure their basic needs are met. Okay, now I'm going to sound like a softie here, but I'll give you an explanation for school lunches. Now, I think school lunches probably are not needed as much as they're used. But think about this. Right now, if you're listening to me, and you have a hunger pang, except for Joel, who's here in the room with me, the rest of you can get up, go to the refrigerator, grab something, and come back and catch up. Okay? If it's cold, you just grab a blanket and cover yourself up. Why do you do that? Because if you're shivering, it's really hard to pay attention. If you haven't eaten since yesterday's breakfast, your stomach is yelling at you louder than I can talk. So the idea that there are some needs. If somebody can't even pay attention because their stomach hurts, or they're in pain, or they're uncomfortable, working to alleviate those or working to meet those needs helps you get to where you want to be. And so that is the thought. That's the basic, true, good thought behind these things like having school nurses and having free lunches and all of that type of thing. The idea is that we want kids to be ready to learn, and then the government jumps in and does too much, I would say. But there's a good idea behind those, and we should remember those things. If a kid is walks into your Sunday school classroom and they're really hungry, give them something to eat. Now, you're probably not prepared to give them a properly balanced breakfast. But if you can just get that hunger pain to go away, then they will have a much easier time paying attention to you. So work to be sure their basic needs are met. Another thing is to have compassion for the parents. Now we want to jump all over the parents for not taking care of their kids, and they are not taking care of their kids, but they need compassion. They probably grew up, they're probably just doing what they grew up in now. We're in multiple generations of these types of problems. Have compassion on them. Seek to help them. I have two thoughts about this, especially with these types of children. Of course, our church ministry works with these types of children. One thought is, if I can't get the parents, at least I'm going to get those kids, and hopefully those kids' will be better than they are and will change the course of their history. The other thought is, if I can get these kids, maybe that'll give me an inroad with those parents. And if I can help those parents, then the kids are going to get even more than I could give them, because then the parents and me are trying to help them. So both those are true, and I think we have to remember both of those along the way when we're discouraged by a situation that, they moved away. At least we got something to those kids. But we always want to be looking at the parents too and have compassion on them, try to help them. And then seek out good role models for the students. Children of poverty, as they're called, many times they don't have good role models. In fact, some of their only role models are bad role models, so we want to try to help them point out people that are good for them to look up to. All right. So then the last difference that I want to mention, and I don't really, I don't have a lot to say about it, but I do want to mention it because I think it's important for us, and that is gender differences. And almost every single one of our classrooms has boys and girls in them. I'm not saying that there's anything beside boys and girls in our classroom as opposed to many in the world today. Okay, there's only boys and girls, but most of our classrooms has boys and girls in them. There are differences between boys and girls. And those differences are in their lives long before those physical differences kind of develop. Before those develop, they're still boys and they're girls. And there are differences. And the reason those differences are there is because God created them with those differences. The Bible tells us, male and female created he them. So, boys, we know this, but boys are created to become men. And what are men created to do? They're created to work. They're created to lead. They're created to defend. They're created to provide. There's all these responsibilities that men are created to do different. I mean, the men are busy doing this, and the ladies have a completely different set of responsibilities to do. But men are created to do those things, and boys are created to become men. And so instilled in their being a boy are some of those traits. They're fallen traits, they're undeveloped traits, but traits that God has given them to help them be a leader, to be a provider, to be a defender. Boys, I know girls fight, but if a boy fights, that's not a bad thing necessarily. Okay? He ought to be ready to fight for the right things. So then, of course, the corollary is that girls are created to become ladies. Okay? And ladies were created to have certain roles that are different from the men. They're created to support the men. They're created to follow a husband. And so they have built into them, into their fallen, undeveloped nature, some tendencies that need developed toward following, toward supporting, and working, and mothering, and nourishing. Okay? So these are in the girls. So you have boys and girls in the classroom. Generally, girls conform to classroom behaviors better and more easily than boys. Okay? Now, why? Is it because they're better students? They're better people? No, it's because they're created that way. Girls have created in them an undeveloped, fallen, but an instinct toward following. And boys are created to lead. And being in a classroom is not leading. Being in a classroom is following. So, girls conform to classroom behaviors better and more easily than boys. We need to recognize this. Teaching boys to be men without stripping them of their masculinity is a constant battle of teachers, especially of classroom teachers, and I would say especially of female teachers. Okay? I'm not a female teacher, so I don't know. But it occurs to me that I know what I'm supposed to be as a man, and if I see a boy acting up, I'm going to say I want to direct that activity but not squash it. And typically classrooms try to squash activity that's not conducive to the smooth running of a classroom. So when you have boys in a classroom, without losing control of the classroom, we have to let them grow toward being the man that God wants them to be, while respecting the order that should be in a classroom. So that is really something, and I'm not going to give you ideas on this necessarily, just kind of leave it there as a seed to jump on. There's lots of writing. Even secular writers have noticed this issue, but Christian writers have written on this too. If you're interested in that, maybe do a search, find some good Christian writing on it, and think a little bit more about how you treat the boys and the girls in your classroom. Do you treat them all the same? Do you treat the boys worse because they're not as good as the girls? And why is that? Could you change that? And of course, I'm the guy rallying for the boys in your classroom. But I think this is something that's been recognized, especially recently, by many, many people. And over time, it's proven true. All right, so those are several different areas of differences in our classrooms that we come across. I'm just going to review them quickly. We had the kind of the intellectual differences, learning styles, right brain, left brain, modalities, visual, auditory, kinetic or tactile modalities. There's theories of intelligences. I put the link in the chat there to kind of go explore that on your own. See how many different intelligences you have. Some of you have like split personalities probably. But no, how many different intelligences, which intelligences you have are stronger than others. And then we had all that kind of in an academic, mental sense. Then we talked about cultural differences and kind of maybe got a little bit of the definitions of that and some comments on those ideas of prejudice and discrimination. Again, I think our world is overly wrong in its response to prejudice and discrimination. It sees it, but it's responded the wrong way. But that doesn't mean that we don't even see it. We should respond in a biblical way toward it. We talked a little bit about the bias that is in books and curricular materials, how they leave out stuff or how they only show certain things that gives a bias to them. We talked a little bit about children who grow up in poverty, regardless of whether they should be in poverty or not. They are most time because of the irresponsibility of their protectors, their parents. But how can we help those children in those situations? And then we last talked about boys and girls in classrooms and just kind of sent a seed in there for you to consider as you think about how you respond and how you direct and how you guide the boys in your classroom differently from the girls because they are created differently. So sometime in the next week or so, we'll put the link up for the third video on mastering teacher effectiveness. And then, the Lord willing, that we're all here on December 2nd, we will discuss that video, and then we'll discuss motivation and attitude as teaching strategies. So thank you for being with us for tonight's lecture. Hope that it was helpful to you and that you can use these things in the work that you do where you are.